Good afternoon, everyone. How are you? You all refreshed? You want to know, who wants to know about the Renters Reform Bill? Put your hands up. Oh, good. You are at the right debate today. Pleasure to be here. So, we, as landlords, as I said in the first session, we are very adaptable people. We deal with changes, okay? And we know there's loads of changes happening. And actually, under the Renters Reform Bill, which actually, with a white paper, came out in June last year, we know that some of these law changes will happen in the next 2 years, I would say, okay? Draft legislation, which we're all waiting to hear, which will go through Parliament, will be happening in the next 2 to 3 weeks, we believe, before Easter. But I want to introduce you to my esteemed panellists, okay? Hopefully they live up to that great introduction. So we have Head of Communications and PR of Capital Letters, John Rockley.
Hi, yeah, thank you. Capital Letters, in case you don't know, stand 47. Go and talk to our lovely team. We are a not-for-profit organisation, in fact, the not-for-profit organisation owned by London boroughs. We're funded by the Department of Levelling Up Housing and Communities, and we supply private rented properties to London boroughs for working families who need to find a long-term home. So yes, if you want to find out more about that, come to stand 47.
Brilliant, okay. And our next guest is Richard Blanco, who I've known for many, many years and who has the best beard in the business, dare I say that. An amazing beard. We always talk about your beard.
Oh,
so Richard has been a landlord for 20 years. Yeah. He's a London representative of the NRLA and a podcaster, so...
Yes, hello, good afternoon, everybody. Well, the NRLA, for those of you who don't know, we have 100,000 members, over 100,000 members now. We do lots of lobbying on behalf of landlords, so we're always talking to ministers and civil servants, trying to knock some sense into them sometimes. And also we provide a wide range of services for landlords, as well as a free advice line for members. We'd love you to join today, so if you're not already a member, then do come and see us at stand number 50, which is right down near the entrance, and I'll also be doing a talk at 3:30 in seminar room 1, so maybe see you at that later.
Brilliant. And how many of you are members of the NRLA? Put your hands up. Great.
Oh,
okay,
yes.
so the
Hooray.
NRLA, well done. I can't endorse them enough. The NRLA and Capital Letters have kindly sponsored today's afternoon session. And we have Julie Ford, our PRS consultant. Julie, do you want to say hello to the crowd?
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. It's really good to see such a packed audience for us this afternoon. I've been in the private rented sector for just over 30 years. I've worked my way up from being a trainee property manager up to owning my own lettings and property management company. I'm now a consultant to organisations within the property industry, such as the Property Redress Scheme, the NRLA and Shelter.
That's great, thank you. And Julie, I've known you for a long time, and you don't look old enough to work for 30 years in the industry, dare I say it. So, I'm just going to go over the 12-point plan of the Renters Reform Bill, just in case anyone doesn't really know about it. A lot of you might know a few of the headlines that may be happening, and we're going to really delve in deep relating to some of those content. And towards the end of this debate, we're going to open up the mic for the audience. So, we've got a 12-point plan which came out in a white paper which happened in June last year, really with regard to dealing with the non-decent standard of properties within the private rental sector actually stand at 21% below. So the government are intending to halve the 21% of the non-decent home standard in the PRS by 2030. They are looking to abolish non-fault Section 21s and introduce periodic tenancies, reforming new grounds for possession under Section 8, and allowing landlords the ability to evict antisocial tenants, strengthening the grounds for Section 8, more mandatory grounds, and making sure that the courts are more efficient. That can be debatable, obviously. Okay, rent increases once a year, which I think landlords are doing anyway, and tenants to have the ability to challenge excess rent increases. A new single ombudsman that private landlords can join, where landlords and tenants can go to a redress scheme to offer and have redress with regard to complaints and landlords, which could be a landlord not carrying out repairs or anything like that, because letting agents belong to a redress scheme, so that's looking to come in. We're also looking to target unacceptable delays This is what the government want in the courts and the government to introduce mediation and alternative dispute resolution. I'm going on. I don't want to make you fall asleep, by the way. I've only got 4 more left. The introduction of a new property portal to see if it's compliant, to see if it has a gas safety, or to see that it's registered with HMO licensing and MEES, so actually a tenant can look up on a computer before they part with their money, they know it's a decent property. Also, the government are throwing lots more money at enforcement, and we'll talk about enforcement later on, or maybe possibly the lack of enforcement we're seeing in local areas, and that it's illegal for landlords and agents to have bans to say no benefit tenants or children, believe it or not, to rent in a property, which is discrimination, of course. Tenants to the right to request a pet in a property for rent, and landlords to consider it, and also possibly to talk about passporting with regard to deposits. These are the 12-point plans. We're waiting in 4 weeks as to what will be looking to come through, what goes for royal assent and goes into Parliament for it to actually become law. And that's what we're going to be discussing today. So, first off, let's talk about Section 21, okay? How many of you out there have ever served a Section 21 notice on your tenants? I'm sure there'll be quite a few of you.
Wow.
And of course, it's called non-fault, but there's always a fault. Let me open up a question to John on behalf of Capital Letters. How do you think, and how does Capital Letters see the Section 21 being abolished with regard to social tenants?
I mean, it's when we're working at our point in the market, we're already trying to procure sort of periodic, so slightly onto the periodic tenancies, we're looking at procuring two years at a time for our social tenants, because our tenants ultimately are in temporary accommodation as they are, and they're then moving into private rented sector, and then we're giving support through that. So the way that we look at Section 21 is Section 21 is very much sort of, we come to the end of the tenancy, and that's how we then work it, rather than the periodic tenancy taking it over. I mean, we do a lot of work with our tenants because we know that we're trying to reduce the risk for landlords, because, you know, landlords, you want your investment back, you also want reduced risk. And if we're taking on people who are coming out of temporary accommodation and are on benefits, many of them are working, in fact, virtually all of them are working, we're trying to take away that risk so we don't ever get to the Section 21.
But are you seeing more with Capital Letters, and you know, and I've worked with Capital Letters quite closely, are you seeing more landlords serving Section 21 notices, maybe because they're selling?
We're seeing more landlords who are leaving the sector serving the Section 21. We're seeing fewer, and this is anecdotal, and if any of the team in like the back can agree with this, you know, you can wave Maria if you agree. Thank you, Maria. We are seeing a reduction in those landlords who are serving Section 21 because they want to end the tenancy and they just want to, you know, increase rents. We're seeing a reduction in that, but absolutely, as people are leaving the sector, and that is a major problem for trying to procure social housing.
Yeah.
It's a major problem for trying to procure things for that sector.
And I think really what will happen is with my own view, with my landlord action cap on, and we do 2,000 to 2,500 instructions a year, we've seen a massive increase in Section 21. And I think when there will be an abolishment date in the next couple of years, you will get some of those landlords that will panic a little bit and think, actually, it's going to be abolished. I've got to look at the new grounds. I'm going to serve it. At the moment, there's a 6-month lifespan. So I think that there will be an increase while the ban comes in. Coming to you, Richard, on behalf of the NRLA, they call it the accelerated possession procedure. I don't know why, because it's not accelerated.
Yes.
You've got some really interesting stats, haven't you?
Yes, I mean, we did some research amongst our members, and it was 3,500 responses we had, actually. And in fact, following on from your point earlier, 76% of landlords said they were expected to be more selective, and they thought low-income tenants would be hardest hit.
Yep.
So, you know, landlords are expecting to be much more selective when Section 21 is abolished, because of course it's going to be harder if they need to evict tenants around arrears and other issues. Although what landlords told us was that they were not so worried about using Section 8 for arrears, but what they were worried about was antisocial behaviour and damage to the property, because those were the occasions when they really do rely on Section 21. And also, over 90% of landlords said they use Section 21 if they're selling or want to move in. So, that's going to be a concern as well, the sort of freedom to be able to just take back the property if they need to. And there was a lot of concern about the reform of the courts, that it's felt that we really shouldn't be abolishing Section 21 until the courts have been reformed, because the courts are just too slow, and they're going to get even more clogged up when Section 21 is abolished. So that's a big concern, I think, for landlords. And the other issue, of course, is the student sector. But we'll come on to that, I think,
we'll definitely come on to that. And I'll come over to you now, Julie. But I think when we talk about courts, and I spoke to a judge where in the old days, when you used to do an accelerated possession case, a judge used to take 90 seconds in granting a possession order. Now it's the best part of 15 to 20 minutes. Last year, there was about 9,000 accelerated possession cases. In 2015, there was 35,000. I think Section 21 will increase in the next 2 years until it's abolished, because landlords just will be worried about getting their properties back. Landlords exiting the market. Julie, you've done a lot of advisory work at the CAB and with regard to tenants, and I think a big occupational hazard for landlords, and really the biggest victims in all this are the tenants, is councils are still telling tenants to stay put, and it really winds me up. Because all it does is kick the can down the road. It causes more stress to tenants. They're having to wait for a bailiff to do an eviction. When Section 21 is going to be abolished and landlords are going to use Section 8 under rent arrears, that's going to cause more homelessness, isn't it?
I think it will in the long run, yes, absolutely. Because at the moment, the council's default setting is as soon as a tenant has got a Section 21, your rights are stay put until the bailiff turns up. Now, legally, that is correct information. They're not misinforming the tenants. But what they are actually creating is a bigger problem for the tenants in the long run, because those tenants may then have the cost of the courts put onto them, which the landlord is entitled to do by ticking a specific box on the court form. So that means the tenant's now got a debt that they didn't have to have, especially if they're not in rent arrears. With the councils waiting until literally the 11th hour of the bailiff turning up, the councils are then running around like headless chickens, trying to house these poor tenants into temporary accommodation, which genuinely is not suitable for their situations. And then we create even more problems. There isn't enough temporary accommodation out there. So the abolishment of Section 21 really needs to be considered along with homelessness legislation and the Homeless Code of Guidance, because at the moment the two do not run side by side. And removing Section 21 altogether, I think will see councils have a huge problem and will increase homelessness tenfold.
And that's it. And that's an unintended consequence, that all us guys and you landlords, we tell people, we tell the councils, because we know what's happening on the ground, which is an issue. Can I ask you, if Section 21 is abolished, how many of you in the audience will be much more methodical and robust when it comes to referencing? Put your hands up, please. A lot of you. I think that's a sign. How many of you will be looking to get guarantors on board as well? I think there'll be a huge rise. There's a good company actually called Rent Guarantor, Tenant Guarantor out there actually. I think that's going to happen, especially, and I think, like, as we said, the people in the lower income families and tenants are going to be affected. What I wanted to come on to as well was periodic tenancy. So Section 21 is going to be abolished, okay? Section 21 goes, obviously periodic tenancies are going to be brought in. The reason that's been brought in by the government is they want the tenants to have greater security. And actually, I can tell you a stat that 4 years and 4 months is the average term of a tenancy. So actually, tenants are staying longer, even though there's a 6 and 12-month tenancy. I'm going to come to you, Richard, with regard to periodic tenancies and obviously the student market. You touched on it before.
Yes.
Purpose-built blocks are exempt and they can have fixed-term tenancies. They've got to get a hold of this, haven't they? Because actually it could be an absolute nightmare.
Yes, and I mean, at the NRLA conference in November, Felicity Buchan, who was the housing minister then, of course, as we know, the housing ministers go through a revolving door, I'm afraid, but she did say that she would take this away and look at it, and we understand the government is still considering it carefully. The issue is that the white paper said that with purpose-built student accommodation, they could have fixed terms, but where it was a private landlord, there couldn't be fixed terms in the student sector. Now, universities, student unions, landlords associations, everybody is up in arms about this because the way the student market works around the UK or around England is that it's either 9 to 12 month tenancy agreements, and there's a concern that your student tenant could move in September, decide to move out in December if they want. How are you going to get someone until the next academic year to move in? The government argument is that, well, you could get a family to move in January, but in some parts of the UK, the markets are very segmented, and it's difficult to get a family to move into a student-type property. So there's a lot of concern about this, and we really hope the government will come round and allow fixed tenancies in the student sector. I think the other concerns about periodic tenancies is just that it's going to be harder to plan as well. I tend to do 1 year fixed term contracts. It means I can plan. I never let contracts end in August because I tend to go away then. So those sorts of aspects are going to be frustrating as well, I think. But it seems that the government and in fact the Deluxe Select Committee report, they all think that periodic tenancies are the way forward. Although importantly, the Select Committee does agree with the NRLA that student tenancies should be fixed terms and they shouldn't be ongoing.
So there could be a change, keep fingers crossed.
They could, yes.
Julie, with regard to periodic tenancies, how does it create more security for tenants?
I genuinely don't think it does, to be perfectly honest with you, because I'm a tenant myself as well as being a landlord, and the first thing that I look for when I move into a property is security. I don't want to think in 2 months' time I'm going to be turfed out, I've got to pack them boxes up and off I go. My home is my home, whether I own it or whether I rent it. And what's important to tenants is exactly the same thing. Now, I can see the logic behind this renters reform bill and making periodic tenancies, which gives the tenant the opportunity to get out quick if there is a problem with a type of tenancy, or the property, or even their landlord. I understand that. And maybe that should have been brought in as a mandatory ground as opposed to just having periodic tenancies across the board. But I don't genuinely see how this gives tenants more security.
Yeah, I mean, moving on to, so what happens is, and I think we all agree, and I've spoken to many people about this, is you can't abolish Section 21 until you get the grounds of Section 8 strengthened. The court system needs major improvement. It needs to go more digital. Tenants need to have access with regard to legal advice. We need more judges. We need more bailiffs. I can tell you now there's a massive problem with regard to recruitment everywhere, every industry, which is challenging. At the moment, there's 17 grounds to carry out for possession. 2 grounds are mandatory, of which one is hardly ever used. Everyone knows about Ground 8, Section 8, where it's been put forward that a mandatory ground, at the notice period will be 4 weeks and the renter is be 3 months, okay, which will be widened. They are looking for mandatory grounds, I believe, Richard, relating to moving back into the property,
yes,
selling the property. You've got a bit more information from that report, haven't you?
Yes, that's right. And this was an important win, I think, for the landlord community. The idea that we would be able to give the tenant 2 months' notice if we want to move into the property, or if we wanted to sell it. And in fact, the grounds for moving in would allow us to move a close family member in as well. It wouldn't just have to be you, the landlord, or your partner. It could be potentially a cousin or some other relative. We are a bit concerned that this could get kind of mauled as it goes through Parliament, if you like. And certainly the Deluxe Select Committee have said that they think it should be watered down. So the current proposal in the white paper is that once the tenant's lived in the property for 6 months, the landlord could then give 2 months' notice to either move in or sell the property. Once the tenant's moved out, the landlord wouldn't be able to re-let it for 3 months. Well, what the Select Committee is saying is the tenant should be in the property for a year, so it's lengthening that from 6 months to a year. Yes, the landlord can give 2 months' notice, but then they wouldn't be able to get another tenant into the property for 6 months. So they're concerned that landlords are going to game the system. And I feel frustrated about that because I think they're showing a mistrust, and it's a kind of tarring all landlords with the same brush, that sort of negative media stereotype that we can't be trusted, and so, we've got to put in extra provisions because landlords, behave badly. So I'm frustrated about that, but I do fear it's a signal as to how things might go as this starts to work its way through Parliament. And I think we need to really try and protect the provisions as they stand in the White Paper.
Yeah, and John, with regard to, obviously, Section 21 is going to be abolished, and landlords are going to have to rely on Section 8, and obviously, you have a lot of vulnerable tenants, social tenants that you try and rehouse at capital letters. How do you think the impact will be?
Yeah, it's in our sector of the market, and I hate to sort of term people as a market, but ultimately we're talking about working families in London who are ostensibly they're on benefits, they're probably in low-paid jobs, they're coming out of temporary accommodation, as I said. When they start to get into difficulties with their arrears, there are, there's products out there, there's insurances you can get.
I know you do insurance.
Yeah, we do a rent insurance that just helps you get over that sort of lump. But we really don't want to see with this legislation the ability to then have that revolving door of going back into homelessness, coming out because you've then found that there's serious arrears over a period of time, and then going back in. What we do is try and offer light support for tenants, so that's ensuring that they've got their benefits in place, they've got all of those things that can then help to maintain that tenancy. But we know that from our point of view, we are asking quite a bit of landlords. We do understand that there is a bit of altruism that landlords have to come in this with people who are on low incomes, who are coming out of temporary accommodation. I mean, just thinking about how many hands went up about the referencing earlier on. A lot of these people won't have those references. They'll be absolutely stable, they'll have jobs, they'll be claiming benefits, they'll be absolutely stable, but our concern is as soon as a 0 hours contract suddenly goes a bit rough for these really good tenants, we start to get into difficulty, and we start to actually put more pressure on the landlords as well. And then the landlords back away from the sector because they think, we've got such a longer process to go through.
I think it's really, really difficult. You've got LHA rates that are frozen to 2024. Doesn't help. We have, like I said, you've got council waiting lists of 24 years. Temporary accommodation should be up to 6 weeks. I think the latest spend was up to £700 million, £100 million increase on the year on year. All the hotels are booked up. I mean, it must be really traumatic for tenants' families that are living in temporary accommodation. Actually should be for 6 weeks, some of them been for a year, 2 years. And I think obviously the challenge that you have is in a really booming hot market where obviously rents are going up. I think obviously morally it's a great thing that landlords are helping out social tenants, but their interest rates have just gone up, and it's really, really challenging, and it's a real quandary depending on where that property is. I just want to ask you, Richard, with regard to the landlord redress that's going to be, we think there's going to be 4 or 5 landlord redress, property portal, banning of Section 21, periodic tenancies. We think they're going to be the highlight 4 things out the 12 point, and obviously money for enforcement, and we're going to talk about enforcement shortly. With regard to landlord redress, and obviously I know the property redress scheme in an organisation I'm tied to, one of the companies that we do, we've done a pilot scheme with 5,000 NRLA members, and I must admit the NRLA members and landlords that are here, you're the good guys because you're here and you want to know about what's going on. Is it time that landlords should be part of a redress scheme and have some sort of accountability like letting agents?
Well, I think the position the NRLA have taken on this is that we've seen it coming. This government has been very keen on seeing tenants as consumers and needing consumer protection. And we feel it's not too onerous. It would be worse for us to dig our heels in and say we don't want it, and then for the government to sort of invent some horror story that's expensive and that's a bit like landlord licensing. So we've tried to get involved early on to try and make it cost effective and work in a way that's good for landlords and for tenants, of course. Interestingly, the Select Committee has said that they think that the 2 bodies should be merged, so there shouldn't be a separate ombudsman or redress scheme for landlords and a separate one for letting agents. it says it thinks that there should just be one, and I think there's quite a lot of sense in that. And I think the idea of mediation is brilliant, and I'd like to see more mediation and a lot more emphasis on that.
Okay.
And the government did hint at that in the white paper,
Yeah.
but there wasn't a lot of practical stuff on how it might happen.
Yeah.
And certainly, the courts as it stands are going to be absolutely overwhelmed. So I think we're going to have to find different avenues, and mediation, I think, is going to be one
That's
of
a
them.
seamless link into mediation, so well done. I'm going to pass on to Julie. I mean, what happened was, during I'll tell you a personal story. During lockdown, I was getting contacted every single day by landlords and tenants, both. Landlords were doing amazing jobs, I mean, absolutely major. And I run a website called Landlord Zone, which is one of our websites, and I would recommend you to all subscribe. It doesn't cost anything. And we did a section called Landlord Hero, right? And we were doing some amazing stuff. I mean, obviously, good landlord stories don't really make the news, but we wanted to highlight, rent-free periods, shopping, this, that, whatever, key workers, some amazing stuff that was happening. And when the notice periods went to 6 months, I said to my team, we need to start mediating. So we set up a business in 3 weeks, a mediation business at the Property Redress Scheme. What happened was the government introduced a mediation pilot, which they spent about £1.3 million on, which didn't work because they decided to do mediation at hearing stage. You never do a mediation at hearing stage. By that time, the parties are too acrimonious against each other. You've got to start really early on. So, Julie, you work with our team at the Property Redress. You do mediation.
Yes.
Tell the audience the advantage of doing mediation at the right time and some top tips.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, from my perspective as a mediator, I think you cannot do it too early. And the earlier you get mediation into the mix, the better, and the better outcomes you're going to get. I mean, the cases that I see coming through the Property Redress Scheme are communal garden cases. They're rent arrears, they're tenants not giving access. The landlord served a Section 21 but doesn't want to go through the court process, so I'm looking at helping the tenant find a date to move out. We're issuing deeds of surrender to help everything come to a mutually beneficial outcome. I think the problem with the pilot that the Ministry of Justice ran, as Paul just said, it was too late in the game. Everybody had fallen out, everybody wasn't talking, and everybody wanted their day in court to prove their point. Mediation needs to come in really, really early, where people are still at a point where they can negotiate and where they can get outcomes that they are responsible for. If someone is responsible for the outcome that they're creating, that empowers them, and that gives them the opportunity to want to be ownership of that outcome. That then gives them a feeling that they haven't been told they've got to get out, they've got to pay those rent arrears. They've come to that agreement by themselves, a payment plan they can afford, for example, rather than one being put on them. And I think the key thing here is when you go to court, the judge tells you what your outcome is going to be. Mediation gives you the control to control your outcome and manage yourself out of the property, yourself out of the rent arrears. And I just think the sooner you can get into mediation, it's better for everybody, landlords and tenants.
Yeah, good point. I bet it takes two to tango, by the way. If your tenants want to mediate and they ignore you, then what can one do?
Yeah.
And that does happen a lot, doesn't it, Julie?
It does happen, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so John, I want to ask you with regard to your capital letters hat on, with regard to the decent home standard, and it was surprising that 21% was the highest out of the housing sectors with regard to non-decent home standard in the property, in the private rental sector. And I thought social housing was worse. And I appeared on ITV with Dan Hewitt, and he was showing mushrooms on the wall with council houses in Croydon. But apparently the private rental sector is the worst, right? What's the feeling with regard to some vulnerable tenants and with regard to the plans of the non-decent home standard?
Well, first of all, can I just say I spent the last 8 years in housing associations, so I'd like to apologise unreservedly for sucking everybody into that story about mould and mushrooms on walls.
And mould, especially what happened with the poor young boy a few weeks ago, which was absolutely tragic.
And there is absolutely no excuse, but the legislation has recently been changed in the social housing sector as well, and the Ombudsman is much more powerful in the social housing sector, and the regulation is much more powerful in the social housing sector. And what happens in the social housing sector, eventually sort of a ghost of that gets towards the private rental sector.
Right, but on that point, with regard to that poor young boy that died, unfortunately, with regard to a council or housing association property, if that was a private landlord, that landlord would end up in prison.
Oh, absolutely.
So what accountability and what enforcement has happened or should have happened to the CEO of that housing association?
Well, if you remember with that particular case, the CEO issued a video saying he wasn't going to resign and then was fired 2 days later. So it's, I think
But that's just losing his job.
Oh, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And if we're talking about corporate manslaughter, then that ultimately is very much a different thing. But in this public domain, I wouldn't at all want to suggest that would be that was the situation going through. I mean, as Capital Letters, I mean, coming out of my previous experience on this, at Capital Letters, we're already procuring at a decent home standard, because we understand that the people who are coming out of temporary accommodation, who are going then into a home, that first starting off with that decent home is actually the thing that then makes their tenancy more powerfully sort of set to. Because you imagine coming out, and some of the figures you were saying about the temporary accommodation, I've been in the sector a little while, but I've heard sort of, you know, there's been cases of people being in temporary accommodation for 20 years, where it's just been, there's no stock around and nobody can get out.
On that point, actually, I read an article, I can't remember who it was, that there was one person that was on the council waiting list in Wigan, of all places, for 44 years.
Yeah, wouldn't surprise me at all.
Not London, we're talking Wigan.
So in London, obviously, with the superheated market, we're trying to procure a decent home and at a decent standard, and we would expect that from a decent landlord. And I'm sure that, you know, everybody here would expect that. And I suppose really that making sure that legislation in there is almost a tick box exercise to make sure that you're at that stage. Because when that tenant goes in there and they see that home at a decent standard, we very much believe that that's the thing that sets their relationship with the landlord and with the home.
Yes.
That's the thing that makes that person want to stay there and keep it nice, you know, on the whole.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, you know, there's unicorns in this as well. But that's really what we try and do at Capital Letters, is make sure that first relationship bit is absolutely set.
Okay.
And then that's much smoother, you know, and you don't get the complaints about having a rubbish home.
Yeah. Okay. So, yeah, thank you. So let's talk about landlord licensing. How many of you landlords pay a license to your local council? Put your hands up. Who lugs? Put your hands up if you enjoy paying that license fee. You do, you're the only one. So this brings me on to landlord licensing and the proposed property portal, whereby your property will have a unique URL number and actually everything is registered against that property. There is an argument, and I know the NRLA are saying, actually, if you bring the property portal in, why do you need landlord licensing? Now, I have shadowed Harrow Council, and it interlinks with regard to the lack or the possible lack of enforcement as well, which, I mean, obviously the NRLA have done some reports on that. What's the NRLA's view with regard to the portal and licensing and how it needs to be reformed?
We're really keen to talk about the potential for the proposed property portal to take away the need for discretionary licensing. So that's selective and additional licensing that 24 London boroughs have brought in. It's expensive, it's bureaucratic. It's really about revenue raising for local authorities to run their private sector housing departments. Something like 70 to 80% of landlords in the consultations that they have to do say they don't want it, but the council still brings it in. So we'd really like to see the property portal, which will be a place where people will upload things like their gas safety and electrical safety certificates and so on, become the means for local authorities to monitor what's going on in the private rented sector and then carry out enforcement. But the other side of this is local authorities are just not doing enforcement. We did a report called the Enforcement Lottery, and we found that 50% of enforcement notices were being issued by 20 local authorities in England. You know, the other 300 and something were doing practically nothing. So there's no central collection of data, there's no sharing of good practice. So there's a lot of work to be done around local authority enforcement. The Deluxe Select Committee agrees with us on this, by the way. And we interviewed Clive Betts this week about this, and he says he thinks the government really doesn't know what it's doing with the property portal. And my concern as well is that it's going to be expensive. And, I don't know where they're going to get the money to do it in these difficult times. So it is a concern. The other concern is, I think, it will probably come later on in the process. And of course, we've got less than 2 years till the next election. So I can't see it happening before the next election. So it could get lost.
And I think I'm going to come to you in a second, Julia. I mean, let's remember that. We think the election might be in January 2025. And politically, we know the Renters Reform Bill is going to come in. It's obviously cross-party. But I think you've also got to bear in mind that there could be a change of Parliament. And what does that mean to landlords? And so that there's even stuff in the future that landlords have got to address. You've worked with local authorities for many years, Julie. I've shadowed environmental health officers. They have a thankless task. I'm on the TV program Nightmare Tenant Slum Landlords, criminal landlords, the worst landlords that take advantage of vulnerable tenants. How do they get to grip? I mean, they've said in the proposal they're going to throw another £20 million at it. We know the likes of Newham Council make £1 million a year in income. Should they treat it more like a business? And the good landlords don't mind paying it if there's enforcement to go after the bad guys.
Yeah, I think absolutely. And nobody minds paying for something if it works. And that's the key thing here. I think with licensing, a lot of landlords feel that what is it I'm actually paying for here? Is it just to have my name on a list and there's another £600, to the council? But I think the key point that Richard just made was there's only a small amount of the councils that are actually moving forward and doing the enforcement on those properties that aren't up to standard. Now, out of those councils, how many of those are actually being proactive and putting education in place for landlords to be better landlords? Ergo, it will improve the private rented sector by itself. Or are they literally just going for the low-hanging fruit and going, we'll just fine, we'll just enforce, we'll just fine? Because I think if you put the education in place, landlords would happily go along to NRLA meetings that are linked to councils and get the education they need to be better landlords, rather than having to rely solely on just being fined or, pay for a licence that, even though they're good landlords.
Yeah, I mean, really, in Wales, they have Rent Smart Wales, you have to go in courses if you manage. Landlord education is important, isn't it, Richard?
Absolutely, and I would really encourage people to get accredited. I'd like to see many more landlords become accredited. You just need to do a one-day course through the NRLA called Landlord Fundamentals, and provided you complete that successfully, you'll be accredited. But what I wanted to say as well, Paul, was that I think that the cause of poor property conditions in the private rented sector is about supply. What we ideally need is slightly too many properties in the private rented sector, and what we have at the moment is a chronic shortage. And because we have a chronic shortage, all those terrible properties at the bottom of the pile get let because people are desperate. Now, the government has been squashing investment in the private rented sector since George Osborne brought the tax changes in 2015. We're delighted to see that the Select Committee agrees with us that taxation needs to be reviewed because it's putting off landlords investing. We're seeing the private rented sector start to shrink, and all that does is it means it's more likely that those poor quality properties will get rented. What we need is to remove those harsh tax changes that were brought in, bring more investment into the sector, and have slightly too many properties so that the bad ones don't get let.
Yeah. I mean, you touched on Section 24. I talked about it this morning, where landlords are being taxed on turnover, not profit, and it has been one of the major influences on possibly landlords leaving. I mean, I picked up this fact, and I do recommend that the English Housing Survey have just brought out a brand new report, a 70 page. I actually was here at 7:30 this morning reading it, believe it or not, so I feel a bit weary-eyed. But there was one fact that I saw from 2016 to 2020, companies set up to hold properties has eclipsed those of the last 50 years. There's so many people who are setting up SPVs and companies. I know that the NRLA have done a campaign, and will it be reversed with Section 24? It needs some severe campaigning. There's some serious money that the Treasury are making out of landlords, aren't they?
I think it's $3 billion, isn't it? I could be wrong. I'm just from reading it recently.
£3 billion.
It's something like that, I think. But what's good on this story, I think, Paul, is that this time last year, it was very difficult to get journalists to understand what Section 24 was, very difficult to get politicians to talk about it as well. And we've completely overcome that now. You know, you'll
and
hear...
And the additional 3% stamp duty
And
as well.
the additional 3% stamp duty. So it's routine on, you know, programmes like Money Box or You and Yours on Radio 4 or on BBC stories covering rent issues, for them to talk about the taxation of landlords and to see the select committee say that it needs to be looked at. I hope we're getting some momentum on this, because it is, you know, one of the biggest issues affecting landlords in the private rental sector.
And it's just, and then I am going to talk on one more subject, and then we're going to open up some questions. But one stat out of that report has said the private rental sector at the moment is 19%. It's actually stagnated since 2013 to 14. So it actually hasn't grown. But actually an interesting stat, which I picked up, and I mentioned this morning, which is really interesting, the biggest private rental sector landlord, Granger PLC, the private landlord, who have over 15,000 properties, have said they think that the private rental sector will grow from 4.7 million dwellings to 7.2 million dwellings by 2025. So you are seeing, you are seeing a lot of funds, you've seen a lot of build to rent coming in, there's more pipeline more than ever, but obviously planning is a problem. I just want to talk about one thing that's an issue, and maybe all of you can give some comments on it, is EPCs. We talked about it this morning, okay? I look at everyone, I thought banning Section 21, Section 24 coming in, you know, I think, oh, blimey, you know, what more's coming down the track? Actually, EPCs, I think, is going to probably be the biggest threat for some landlords, possibly one step too far, you know, depending if you've got a property that's a D or an E, trying to get it up to a C. As I said, there's lots of government grants out there, depending on where you're based, and you need to look into that. What's the view of the NRLA on EPCs? I can't see it. We talked about this backstage. I can't see it coming in by 2025. Can you, Richard?
No, absolutely. And one of the issues on this is the government did the consultation in January 2021. That's when it ended. And we still have not had an announcement on what's happening with minimum energy efficiency standards. So we were told it was going to be C by 2025 for new tenants or 2028 for existing tenants. And what we're saying at the NRLA is it's taking too long. We need a clear timescale here, and the earliest we think that people can do this is by 2028. There's something like 67% of properties in the private rental sector at the time of the consultation are a D or lower. So there's a huge amount of work to be done in the private rental sector. And in theory, we're supposed to be spending up to £10,000 per property to bring it up to a C. We're also arguing that's not fair on properties in parts of the country you know, where properties are worth a lot less and people are getting less rent in. So we think that amount should taper down, you know, if you're in a place where you don't get so much rent. But I think the other issues about this, I mean, I've got 8 terraced houses. Some of them are in conservation areas. The only way they're going to get up to a C, if they manage to get there, is by doing external cladding or interior solid wall insulation. And some of the measures that you would have to try and do are just never going to get the property up to a C.
But on that point, common sense has got to kick in. There's got to be some exemptions, because the government have got to realise that actually, you know what, Section 21 is going to be banned in a couple of years' time. This is coming in. Actually, do I need to whack a Section 21 in? I mean, what's Capital Letters' view on this?
We're sort of in a duality here, particularly with the EPCs, because we understand that the people who are going into your homes ultimately need as the big enough wiggle room in their pricing, in their bills as possible. So going into an EPC, band C and above, lower bills, lower fuel bills, and particularly at the moment with the fuel crisis, we're looking at enormous heating bills. We want to have cheaper running houses, but we also understand that the homes that are getting the lower rents that we're possibly procuring are nowhere near an EPCC. And the last thing we want to see is people leaving the sector and then leaving those homes for our people to procure. And we are really stuck between a rock and a hard place on this one because of that. We want it to be cheap to run, but we don't want the lack of stock.
And I think also you've got to realise with regard to lending criteria, You know, there's stress testing going on with mortgages. You know, they're also actually saying, well, can you afford to pay the mortgage at this interest rate, even though it's this at the moment? What grade is it with regard to EPCs? What's your view, Julie, on EPCs and the upgrades and how landlords should deal with it?
I mean, I think EPCs are probably more of an issue for landlords and giving them more sleepless nights than the abolishment of Section 21, to be honest with you. I think the worry is they're not going to be able to get their properties up to the C, especially with the amount of money that's now required. So at the moment, to get your property up to an E, your maximum spend is 3,500. That's jumping up to 10 grand.
10,
that's
15
a
grand.
big, that's a big jump for landlords to have to find. Like you've said, there will be exemptions, like there currently is already. You've got the high spending threshold, you've got third-party consent threshold, you've got those there as well. And we're likely to see those exemptions continue and maybe some added. But the big thing is, at the end of the day, as a country, we have been building for an awful long time, and some of our buildings have been standing since the 1500s, the 1600s. You are never going to get those properties up to a C. But also you have to understand, people genuinely want to live in those character buildings. So you can't remove them from the private rented sector, because I don't want to live in a modern white box.
But then it forces rents up as well,
character.
doesn't it? It forces rents up as well. The money's got to come from somewhere. Should we ask some questions to the audience? So we've got Judy and Kate. Hands up. This gentleman in the front, please. Just take this mic, please. Thank you.
Could it be a possibility that EPCs might not have that new regulation might not have to be met if the landlord were to include the fuel bills in the rent? Do you think? Is that a possible way around it?
I mean, Richard, what's your view on that?
I
doubt very much, to be honest.
I think that's unlikely, yeah. Because it's about, trying to get the UK economy to net zero. So, I mean, the big problem we've got in the PRS is a third of our properties were built before 1919, and that's why so many of them are not energy efficient, because the Victorians and Edwardians didn't build energy efficient properties because they didn't understand the whole thing. Yes, here you are, yes. So, yeah, I think we're going to have to play our part in the private rented sector, but I think the government's going to need to invest a lot more money and help us along the way a lot more.
100%. More money. Where are they going to find it? This chap here, please.
Hearing about the Ombudsman being mentioned, what powers are the Ombudsman going to actually have?
Okay, so I can touch on that and then I'll pass that on to Julie. So the question is, what will the Ombudsman have with regard to landlord redress? Currently, they have powers, the landlord redress have powers to fine a letting agent up to £30,000. They work with trading standards. There's another argument with trading standards. Do they have enough resource? A bit like with environmental health officers. So the powers would be, there's rent repayment orders that are made. Obviously, how it works is, and I know what we would do at the property redress scheme, we would encourage mediation and to talk, to try and work out the issues, and then until it goes to an adjudicator for a decision to be made. I think if you're a decent landlord, I think there's going to be scenarios where landlords have made some innocent mistakes, okay? How do they learn by those mistakes? But maybe you can just shed a bit of light on that, because obviously you do work with us at the property redress scheme, Julie.
Yeah, absolutely. So at the moment, the redress schemes out there are specifically for letting agents, and obviously this bill is about talking about a landlord's redress scheme specifically. My concern with that is, what would the genuine consequences be to a landlord? Yes, they can be fined, and the bill is talking about a £25,000 limit on the fine, as Paul talked about rent repayment orders. But with the property redress scheme that we have at the moment and the property ombudsman, letting agents can actually be thrown out of those schemes, and it's a legal requirement for them to be a member of those. If it's going to be a legal requirement for a landlord to be part of a redress scheme, what happens if they're thrown out? Does that mean they can never be a landlord? For me, there's not enough detail come out in the bill at the moment. The devil's in the detail for this one, I think, for me. I just need more information on how that's going to really process. Or is it just a case of landlords will just keep being fined? I just need more detail.
I remember, I can just shed a bit, I remember I was in a working group when they brought out Rowe landlord database and Rowe letting agent database. I was on that I was on that working group, and I obviously said, what about road tenants? And obviously that didn't go down very well with the government. But that where there is also banning orders for letting agents, okay? I came up and then they started bringing it in for landlords. I said 3 strikes and you're out. If you're a landlord and you've actually been found guilty on 3 occasions, you should never be able to rent before. And actually, the local authorities do have power, a bit like a receiver with an agent, to take over properties to full management. And I think that if we enforce more and they use the able to and the weaponry to be able to enforce that they should be able to enforce. A lot of it is convoluted and it costs too much money. So a lot of the time they don't bother doing it, but there could be a lot of fixed penalties that are given as well. Any other questions? This gentleman here in the front. Thank you, Jodie.
Hello, guys. Hi, Julie.
Hello.
I know Julie. I'm part of a property network.
She's with Julie. She's with Julie.
So my question is not directly for landlord, but normal scenario. I work in the rent-to-rent service accommodation area. I am a service accommodation operator.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, will there be any impact? Not that there shouldn't be, for us as we have tenants on a short-term basis, not like the 6 months or whatever, anything like that. They're sometimes here for 2-3 days, 2-3 months.
You're talking about the Airbnb market.
Effectively, yes. Yeah.
There could be a knock. I'm going to let Julie answer this because. Yeah.
Yeah, I think at the moment, looking at the bill, the answer to that is no. There's not going to be a direct effect on you, simply because this bill is about tenants and that property being their main and principal home. But it's very possible that the government will see that the serviced accommodation, the holiday let industry, is a taxable area, and they might find a way of having you guys to be licensed and et cetera, et cetera. But I think that is probably quite far down the road at this stage. But for me at the moment, the bill doesn't really hold too much for you to worry about.
Do you want to add something,
Yes,
Richard?
there was. The government did carry out a consultation last summer, a 3-month consultation on a registration scheme for the holiday let sector. And I just checked on the website today, and they haven't come back on that yet, but there's one coming in Scotland, I believe, in April. I think the one in Wales is already in force. So I do think we're likely to see some sort of...
In Scotland and in Edinburgh, they brought in taxation on Airbnb, which is a massive problem.
So I think we're likely to see a registration scheme in England at some point.
And I would always say, keep an eye on Scotland, because whatever Scotland does, we're usually a couple of years behind. You know, in December 2017, we saw Scotland put their Housing Act and all their tenancy agreements in the shredder, and now look at what we're doing a couple of years down the line. So always keep an eye on Scotland. We're not normally far behind.
I must admit, their first-tier tribunal has been a complete mess.
Well, yes.
Okay, hopefully it doesn't follow suit. Any other questions, please? Gentlemen, right at the back. Keep your hand up, please. Jodie's coming over to you, and then I've seen you over there in a minute. Okay, we've got 5 minutes left.
Thank you very much. If the government's so desperate to get to net zero, why are homeowners not being forced to increase their energy performance of their own properties?
Oh, that's a
Very good question.
It is, yes.
I'm homeowners and net zero. Who would like to answer that?
There's more of them.
Well, there's 68%. 68% of the market, I think it's 68 if I remember rightly, is home ownership. Okay, Richard, do you want to share a bit of light on that?
Yeah, I mean, just to say that the problem we've got in the home ownership sector, only 10% of the properties are pre-1919, 5% in the social sector are pre-1919. So it is a bigger problem in the private rented sector, just because of the age of the stock as much as anything. I suspect forcing homeowners to bring in energy efficiency improvements could be quite difficult to do in legal terms. I'm not quite sure how we do it.
At the end of the day, we are paying, homeowners pay their mortgage and they pay it to their lender. You're renting out to a third party and you have a responsibility to that third party who are now, and I've said this morning, are now paying 38% of their income to you as rent, you know, and the government has said, well, you know what, you've got to make sure that you're compliant, especially with regard to the Green Deal.
I mean, it's worth mentioning possibly that housing associations are also going through this pain.
Yeah.
They're putting in millions to try and get their homes up to Band C, and they're divesting a lot of stock that will never get there. and that's having a direct effect, again, on the social housing sector as well. So it's,
Okay.
we're
I
not
think
alone in here.
Sorry, I think off the back of that as well, it's down to choice, because at the end of the day, a tenant can choose a multitude of properties to rent based on how much their energy bills are going to be. A homeowner can choose to swap energy suppliers. So I think, again, it boils down to choice, and the fact that your tenant is your customer and you are there to provide a customer service. I think that comes down to that as well.
But
Yeah,
there's a lack of choice, of course, at the moment because of a lack of supply.
Well, yes.
So in theory, that would be nice.
we,
but
we,
yes.
we are in a rental stock crisis. There's no choice about that. One last question for this gentleman here.
Thank you. Yeah, got a real quick one, and then a longer one, which is EPC related. The quick one is with the database that they're talking about, landlord registration. How does that work with GDPR rules?
Well, I mean, I can answer that, and then we move on to EPC, so I'm conscious of time.
Yeah.
Basically, what will happen is it will be mandatory, a bit like what happens with a deposit scheme. You know, you have to join it within a certain amount of time. As we've talked about today, there's what, 2.6, 2.8 million landlords. When you are, there will be some sort of registration process, so you will have to pay a fee, maybe it might be 50 quid a year for argument's sake. You'll be part of a redress scheme.
Yeah. I mean,
obviously that data is going to be the government's data. They have access to redress schemes, they have access to deposit schemes, they have access to land registry
it was
data as well.
suggested earlier by yourself that tenants will just be able to go and have a look at this and see whether, he's an okay landlord.
Oh,
Well,
right, yeah, so it's
GDPR,
like- yeah, so-
if I can see gas safety certificates,
Yeah, so
then
you're
there's the
talking about
names of previous tenants on it.
They're two different things. One's a landlord redress,
Yeah.
and one is a landlord property portal.
Yeah.
The property portal will be good for landlords,
Yeah.
will be good for
No, I agree.
tenants, and
I
good
agree.
for agents. So a tenant...
But GDPR, how does that work?
Well, no, I mean, what's going to happen is it will be, I mean, how they put the prop tech together is going to be something completely different. How they gather the information, I mean, the devil's in the detail, but actually to have a fully compliant property, you know, which would say it's a C, which would say that it's got everything relating to that property. And it helps with the tenant because the problem is the tenant is not driven by the agent or the landlord, they're driven by the property. And then, of course, you get fake landlords and all that stuff. So it can only be good. I don't know, you know, I think we all agree with this, don't we?
I will just add on to that to answer your question quickly. The reason why it won't be affected by GDPR is GDPR is a regulation.
Yeah.
This will be mandatory statute law.
Correct.
Statute law supersedes regulation.
Yeah,
Okay.
definitely.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that
Brilliant,
concise
brilliant.
answer.
So, okay, have you got one more question? Is it very quick?
Yeah, very quickly. EPC, it is the biggest nightmare, particularly for properties in the Midlands. I know London has a bit of an issue, but properties in lower value properties in Midlands and North, they're all old properties, 1905, single brick, no cavity, nothing. How you're ever going to, one, find workmen to upgrade them, two, do the works with tenants in situ.
You need to get access,
Yeah, and whether you can actually possibly get to a C is most of the time ain't going to happen, regardless how much money you throw at it.
So, look, Richard,
It's
just to answer
bonkers.
No, I agree with you.
And
I
there's
think
going to be a lot of homelessness.
I totally agree with you. The devil's in the detail. Do not panic. Do not panic, landlords. Wait and see. You know, Richard, the last comment
Yeah, I mean, I
relating
think
to that,
you've
please.
answered your own question, really.
You have
there.
answered
There's a
your own
shortage
question.
of labour. You know, there are because so many of the a third of the properties in the private rented sector are pre-1919. It's going to be a huge task. I mean, what we've been arguing is properties in the Midlands where, you know, perhaps the property's worth 100,000, to make you spend up to 10,000 is probably disproportionate, where somebody in London with a property that's worth £1 million, you know, only has to spend 10,000. So we do think there should be some tapering there.
It should be
based on the
related to
rent.
rent. I totally get it.
Mm.
So just wrapping this up, go to the NRLA stand, looking to be a member, to inform yourself. Capital Letters have a stand. I've got a stand, 3 stands down there for landlord action. Hope you've enjoyed the session, got something out of it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.